The cruelest part about being forgotten isn't the silence, it's watching people decide your worth before you ever speak. My name is Ethan Miller, and by the time I turned 23, I had learned that disappointment could wear an expensive suit and smile politely across a dinner table. The invitation resting in my trembling hand promised opportunity, a carefully arranged blind date with Ryan Carter, the successful son of one of the city's most respected investment families. My stepmother called it my last chance to prove I wasn't a burden. She reminded me that respectable alphas didn't wait forever, especially for an omega who had spent years quietly fading into the background. So I borrowed the nicest blazer I owned, straightened the sleeves twice, and stepped into Belmont House, the most exclusive restaurant downtown, where crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors and conversations never rose above a practiced whisper. Everyone inside looked like they belonged there. Their confidence filled the room more completely than the music drifting from the grand piano. I, on the other hand, felt like an accidental guest who had wandered into someone else's celebration. The hostess guided me toward a reserved table overlooking the skyline. Ryan wasn't there yet. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Around me, couples laughed over candlelight while waiters floated between tables carrying elegant plates that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I checked my phone twice before another message appeared from my stepmother. Don't embarrass us. Smile. Be grateful he agreed to meet you. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Maybe traffic was bad. Maybe something unexpected happened. Then the restaurant doors opened, and Ryan finally walked in. He wasn't alone. A beautifully dressed omega clung comfortably to his arm while Ryan laughed at something only the two of them seemed to understand. They walked directly toward my table without the slightest hint of apology. Ryan barely looked at me before letting out a tired sigh. "So you're Ethan?" His voice wasn't angry. Somehow that made it worse. It carried the casual disappointment of someone returning an online order that didn't match the picture. He glanced toward his companion before speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Honestly, my parents should stop setting these things up. Soft laughter drifted from somewhere behind me. My face grew warm, but I refused to lower my eyes. Ryan slid into the chair across from me while his companion remained standing beside him, making it painfully obvious who actually mattered. "You're probably a nice person," Ryan continued with a shrug, "but this was never going anywhere." He smiled as though kindness could erase humiliation. Around us, conversation slowed. Curious eyes wandered toward our table before politely pretending not to stare. I realized then that I wasn't part of a blind date. I was part of an audience's entertainment. Somewhere across the restaurant, a private elevator opened with a quiet chime. The atmosphere shifted so subtly that almost no one noticed at first. Conversation softened. Staff straightened instinctively. Even Ryan's confident smile faded for the briefest moment. Without understanding why, I found myself looking toward the entrance as a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit stepped inside, followed by only a single assistant. I didn't know his name yet, but somehow the entire room seemed to remember it for me before anyone spoke a single word. Ryan leaned back in his chair as though he had already finished the conversation before it had truly begun. His companion smiled with effortless confidence, slipping into the empty seat beside him instead of allowing me the illusion that this meeting had ever been exclusive. A waiter approached with practiced professionalism, asking whether anyone would like to order drinks. Ryan answered without looking at me. "Bring us your reserve bottle. My guest likes the French vintage." Then he paused just long enough to glance in my direction. "He can have water." The waiter hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding politely. I forced a small smile that fooled no one, including myself. It was not the water that embarrassed me. It was how naturally everyone accepted that I deserved less. Ryan folded his hands on the table. "Let us save everyone some time. My parents insisted that I meet you because our families have known each other for years. They believe every respectable alpha eventually settles down with a respectable omega." He laughed softly. "They forgot one important detail. Chemistry cannot be arranged." His companion rested a hand lightly against Ryan's sleeve, pretending sympathy while enjoying every second of the spectacle. "That sounds difficult," the Omega said with an almost apologetic smile. "Family expectations can be exhausting." Ryan nodded dramatically. "Exactly. Imagine walking into a restaurant expecting possibility and realizing someone else already decided your future." His eyes finally met mine. "Nothing personal, Ethan. You simply are not what I am looking for." The words were calm, measured, almost gentle. Somehow that kindness cut deeper than anger ever could. Around us, conversations resumed, but I noticed curious glances drifting toward our table before quickly looking away. People rarely interrupted uncomfortable moments. They preferred observing them from a safe distance. I reached for my glass of water before remembering it had not yet arrived. My hand settled quietly in my lap instead. "You could have cancelled," I said as evenly as I could. Ryan shrugged. "Then my parents would have complained for weeks. This is faster." His companion chuckled. "At least now everyone can move on." Everyone. As though I had never been an individual with expectations of my own. As though I were simply another appointment on someone else's calendar. My phone vibrated beneath the table. Another message from my stepmother appeared across the screen. "Smile. Do not ruin this. If he rejects you, do it gracefully." I stared at the words for several seconds before locking the screen. Even failure apparently came with rules. A nearby table erupted in laughter over an unrelated joke, and for a brief moment I wished I could disappear into the background noise forever. Then something unexpected happened. Every member of the restaurant staff subtly shifted their attention toward the entrance without abandoning their duties. The maître d', who had barely acknowledged anyone all evening, personally walked across the marble floor with quiet urgency. Several influential businessmen who had been speaking confidently only moments earlier suddenly lowered their voices. It was as if an invisible current had passed through the entire room. Ryan noticed it too. His confident posture stiffened almost imperceptibly before he tried pretending nothing had changed. His companion followed everyone's gaze toward the entrance and whispered, "Is that really him?" Ryan answered under his breath, "Do not stare." Naturally, those 3 words guaranteed that I looked. The tall man I had noticed earlier continued walking through the restaurant with calm, unhurried confidence. He did not seek attention, yet attention followed him anyway. His black suit fit perfectly without appearing flashy. His expression remained unreadable, neither warm nor cold, simply composed. The people nearest to his path instinctively stepped aside without being asked. No introductions were necessary. Respect had already introduced him long before he arrived. He exchanged a brief nod with the restaurant owner before continuing deeper into the dining room. I assumed he was heading toward one of the private suites reserved for important clients. Instead, he slowed only a few tables away from ours. His assistant leaned close and quietly said something I could not hear. The man's eyes lifted from the tablet in his hand and settled across the room with deliberate focus. For reasons I could not explain, they stopped on me. Not on Ryan. Not on the elegantly dressed Omega sitting beside him. On me. The forgotten Omega everyone else had already dismissed. For several long seconds, neither of us looked away. I expected him to continue walking, to dismiss the accidental moment of eye contact as easily as everyone else had dismissed me tonight. Instead, his calm expression remained unchanged while his attention rested on me with quiet certainty, as though he were studying a question only he could answer. I looked down first. It seemed safer that way. My pulse had begun to race for reasons I could not explain. I had never met the man before, yet the entire restaurant reacted to his presence as though someone important had entered a courtroom rather than a dining room. Ryan cleared his throat, attempting to recover the confidence that had slipped from him moments earlier. "Forget about him," he muttered to his companion, though his own eyes continued drifting toward the man across the room. "People like us do not cross paths with people like that." His companion nodded quickly. "My father says he owns half the city." Ryan let out a nervous laugh. My father says he could buy the other half tomorrow if he wanted. Their conversation fell into a whisper, but I could still hear enough to understand that whoever this man was, his reputation reached far beyond ordinary business. The maître d' personally escorted him toward a private dining area usually reserved for governors, executives, and foreign investors. Yet before entering, the man stopped again. His assistant quietly handed him a folder, speaking in a respectful tone. The man listened without interrupting, then answered with only a few words. I could not hear what he said, but his assistant immediately nodded and disappeared toward the reception desk. The movement seemed insignificant until I noticed the restaurant manager hurrying across the floor to greet the assistant with visible concern. Staff members exchanged brief glances while maintaining perfect professionalism. Everything happened silently, but it was impossible not to notice that the room itself seemed to revolve around the decisions of one person. I wrapped both hands around the glass of water that had finally arrived. It was cool against my fingertips, helping steady the nervousness building inside me. Ryan noticed my attention wandering and smiled with renewed confidence. Do not misunderstand what you are seeing, he said. Power looks impressive from a distance, but it has nothing to do with us. I gave a polite nod. I was not thinking about power. Really? He asked. Then what were you thinking about? I answered honestly. I was wondering what it feels like to walk into a room without needing anyone's approval. Ryan laughed again, although this time the sound lacked conviction. Approval is earned. I almost replied that. Sometimes approval was inherited instead, but the words stayed where they belonged. Tonight had already taken enough from my dignity. There was no reason to surrender my composure as well. Before either of us spoke again, the assistant returned from the front entrance carrying a simple black umbrella even though the evening sky beyond the windows remained perfectly clear. He placed it near the private dining room before quietly stepping aside. The gesture puzzled me until I realized it was not about rain. It was preparation. Someone accustomed to planning every detail of every situation. The kind of discipline that made people trust him long before he spoke. A server approached our table carrying the expensive bottle Ryan had ordered. As he carefully poured the wine, his hands trembled ever so slightly while glancing toward the private dining room. Ryan noticed it immediately. Relax, he told the waiter with forced amusement. He is not watching you. The waiter smiled politely but did not answer. After setting down the glasses, he excused himself faster than necessary. Ryan's companion quietly leaned closer. Do you know who he really is? Ryan hesitated before speaking, lowering his voice until it was barely above a whisper. Adrian Blackwood. The name settled over the table with unexpected weight. Even I had heard it before. Newspapers described him as a brilliant businessman whose companies expanded faster than analysts could explain. Rumors described something else entirely, stories whispered instead of printed, stories connecting influence, loyalty, and a network of powerful families that reached into every corner of the city. No one ever seemed certain where the truth ended and speculation began. As I absorbed the name, I sensed movement once more. Adrian Blackwood stepped out of the private dining room instead of entering it. Without haste, without uncertainty, he adjusted the cuff of his jacket and began walking directly across the restaurant. This time there was no doubt about his destination. Every measured step brought him closer to our table. The quiet murmur of the restaurant seemed to dissolve with every step Adrian Blackwood took across the marble floor. No one announced his arrival. No one needed to. The confidence in his stride carried the kind of authority that could not be borrowed or imitated. Conversations continued, but softer now, as if everyone instinctively understood that something important was unfolding. I lowered my eyes, convinced he would pass our table without a second thought. Men like Adrian Blackwood did not notice people like me. That was simply how the world worked. Ryan straightened his jacket almost immediately, the easy arrogance that had defined him all evening replaced by careful composure. His companion quietly adjusted his posture as well, suddenly aware of every movement. As Adrian approached, Ryan stood with an eager smile. Mr. Blackwood, he greeted politely. It is an honor to see you again. Adrian stopped beside our table. His expression remained calm, neither friendly nor distant. Ryan. His voice was deep, steady, and remarkably controlled. It was the voice of someone who never needed to raise it in order to be heard. Ryan looked relieved that he had been recognized. I did not expect to run into you tonight. Adrian glanced briefly toward the untouched dessert menu before answering. Neither did I. There was a brief silence. Ryan laughed lightly, trying to fill it. Please, allow me to introduce someone. He gestured proudly toward the Omega beside him. This is Daniel. We have been seeing each other recently. Daniel smiled warmly and extended a respectful greeting. Adrian acknowledged him with a polite nod before his gaze shifted across the table. It settled on me once again. I suddenly became aware of every small imperfection. My borrowed blazer. The inexpensive watch on my wrist. The water glass that remained nearly full because my hands had been too unsteady to drink. Ryan seemed almost reluctant to continue. And this is Ethan Miller. He hesitated before adding, a family acquaintance. Family acquaintance. Not the blind date he had publicly rejected. Not the guest left waiting for half an hour. Just an afterthought. Adrian did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked directly at me with the same composed attention he had shown since entering the restaurant. There was no pity in his eyes. No amusement. More surprisingly, there was no indifference either. Mr. Miller, he said simply. His acknowledgement caught me completely off guard. Good evening, I answered quietly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Adrian gave a slight nod, then turned back toward Ryan. I was told you had dinner plans. Ryan laughed awkwardly. This was complicated. Daniel smiled politely, unsure whether he should speak. Ryan tried explaining anyway. My parents arranged this meeting, but everyone understands that these situations do not always work out. Adrian listened without interrupting. The silence after Ryan finished stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Adrian asked a single question. Did everyone understand that? Ryan blinked. Excuse me. Adrian's attention drifted briefly toward the empty chair opposite mine, then toward the untouched place setting that had clearly been prepared for two people before another guest had arrived unexpectedly. Nothing in his expression changed, yet somehow the simple observation seemed to reveal everything that had happened before he entered. Ryan forced another smile. There are no hard feelings. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward me once more. Is that true, Mr. Miller? The question surprised everyone at the table, including me. No one had asked what I thought all evening. Decisions had been made around me, conversations had happened over me, and expectations had been placed upon me without ever inviting my voice. I searched for the safest answer. I think some evenings simply end differently than people expect. Adrian held my gaze for another quiet moment before the faintest hint of approval softened his otherwise unreadable expression. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Behind him, several diners had begun pretending not to watch, although their curiosity was impossible to hide. Whatever Adrian Blackwood intended to do next, the entire room seemed to sense that this ordinary blind date had quietly become something else entirely. Ryan shifted uncomfortably beneath the growing silence, clearly searching for a way to reclaim control of the evening. He forced another polite smile and reached for his wine glass. I suppose misunderstandings happen, he said. Fortunately, everyone here is mature enough to move on. Adrian did not immediately respond. Instead, his attention remained on me with a level of patience I had not experienced in years. It was unsettling because he did not seem to be judging my clothes, my posture, or the awkward situation surrounding me. He simply observed, as though the noise around us had faded into the background. How long have you been waiting? He finally asked. The question was directed at me alone. I blinked in surprise. About 30 minutes, I answered honestly. Ryan gave an embarrassed laugh. Traffic downtown was terrible. Adrian's assistant quietly glanced toward the restaurant entrance before looking back at his employer. Adrian nodded almost imperceptibly, then returned his attention to Ryan. My office arrived from the same direction less than 10 minutes ago. Ryan's smile tightened. There were other stops. Adrian accepted the explanation with a calm expression that revealed nothing, yet the conversation somehow became even more uncomfortable. He was not accusing anyone. He was simply allowing the facts to exist beside one another. Daniel attempted to ease the tension. I told Ryan we should have called ahead. Ryan nodded quickly. Exactly. Communication could have been better. Adrian looked toward the untouched menu still resting in front of me. Have you eaten, Mr. Miller? I looked down at the table. Not yet. It was the first time all evening that admitting something so simple made me feel unexpectedly vulnerable. Ryan immediately spoke up. We were just about to order. The empty plates and untouched silverware quietly contradicted him. Adrian noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. A server approached cautiously, clearly uncertain whether to interrupt. Adrian accepted a small envelope from him without breaking eye contact with anyone at the table. After reading the brief note inside, he folded it neatly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Thank you, he said. The server nodded with visible relief before quietly leaving. Ryan cleared his throat again. Business never stops for someone like you, I imagine. Adrian offered a faint smile. People are usually more important than schedules. The words settled heavily over the table. I could not explain why they affected me so deeply. Perhaps because they contrasted so sharply with everything I had experienced that evening. For years I had been treated as an obligation to be managed, a responsibility to be transferred, a problem waiting for someone else to solve. Yet this stranger, one of the most influential men in the city according to every whispered conversation around us, had asked whether I had eaten before asking anything else. It was such an ordinary question that it almost hurt. Daniel glanced between Adrian and me with growing curiosity. Have you two met before? He asked. No, I answered immediately. Adrian gave the same answer. This is our first conversation. Daniel looked genuinely puzzled. Then why? He stopped himself before finishing the question. Adrian spared him the discomfort. Because every person deserves the courtesy of being acknowledged. The simplicity of the statement silenced the table. Ryan shifted in his seat once more, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Ethan has always been quiet, he said. He does not really enjoy social gatherings. Before I could respond, Adrian calmly asked, Did he tell you that? Ryan hesitated. Not exactly. Adrian inclined his head slightly. Then perhaps it is an assumption. Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again without speaking. I had never seen him run out of words before. Adrian turned toward me one last time. Mr. Miller, I have attended enough business negotiations to recognize when someone has not been given an equal place at the table. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. Tonight does not appear to be an exception. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. I had promised myself I would not let anyone see how much the evening had affected me. Yet for the first time since arriving, someone had recognized what I had been trying so hard to hide. Around us, conversations resumed in careful whispers, but I could feel dozens of curious eyes drifting toward our table. None of them knew why Adrian Blackwood remained standing there. Neither did I. But deep inside, I sensed that the evening had quietly crossed a point where nothing would return to the way it had begun. Ryan finally pushed his chair back with a strained smile that failed to hide his growing frustration. I think this conversation has become far more serious than anyone intended, he said. There is really no reason for Mr. Miller to feel offended. Sometimes people simply are not compatible. Adrian regarded him with the same calm expression that had never once wavered. Compatibility is a personal decision, he replied evenly. Courtesy is not. The word settled over the table like a quiet verdict. No one argued. Even Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, as though recognizing the truth in what had just been said. Ryan attempted one final recovery. I offered honesty instead of pretending to be interested. Surely that is better than leading someone on. Adrian nodded once. Honesty has value. Public embarrassment does not. Ryan's face reddened ever so slightly. He looked around the restaurant and seemed to notice, perhaps for the first time, that several nearby diners had quietly stopped pretending not to listen. The attention that he had enjoyed only minutes earlier now felt like an unwanted spotlight. I wished the evening would simply end. I had never wanted anyone to defend me, especially not in front of strangers. Every additional second only made me more aware of how small I felt sitting between people who seemed to understand a world I had never belonged to. I quietly reached for my jacket. "Mr. Blackwood," I said softly, "thank you for your kindness, but I think I should leave." Adrian looked at the folded jacket in my hands before answering. "Have you had dinner?" I hesitated. "No." "Then the evening is not over." I blinked, uncertain whether I had heard him correctly. Ryan let out a short laugh. "Surely you are joking." Adrian slowly turned toward him. "Do I appear to be joking?" The laughter disappeared immediately. Another quiet silence followed before Adrian did. Something that no one at the table expected. He pulled out the empty chair across from me and sat down. Not beside Ryan, the man he already knew. Not beside Daniel, who had been introduced moments earlier. He chose the empty seat that had been intended for the blind date from the very beginning. The entire restaurant seemed to pause. Even the pianist missed a note before smoothly continuing the melody. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the table. "Mr. Miller," he said, "if you are comfortable doing so, I would like to have dinner with you." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "With me?" "Yes." I searched his expression for some hint of amusement, some indication that this was an elaborate attempt to make a point. I found none. His composure remained exactly the same. Ryan leaned forward. "Adrian, there is no reason to involve yourself in this." Adrian answered without looking away from me. "I disagree." Ryan's voice became more careful. "This was simply an unfortunate blind date. Then consider this an ordinary dinner." Adrian replied. Daniel looked from Ryan to me and then back again, clearly unable to understand what he was witnessing. "Neither could I. You barely know him," Ryan said quietly. Adrian finally shifted his attention toward him. "That is true." He paused before continuing. "I do know that he arrived on time. I know he was treated as though his presence carried less value than everyone else's. I know he has not been offered a proper meal despite being invited here. Those observations are sufficient for tonight." His words carried no anger, only quiet certainty. Somehow that made them impossible to dismiss. My heart was beating so loudly I wondered whether anyone else could hear it. No one had ever chosen me in front of other people before. Most of my life had been spent trying not to inconvenience anyone, trying to become easy to ignore. Yet the most influential man in the room had just done the exact opposite. Adrian looked back at me, his voice calm enough that only our table could hear the next sentence. "Mr. Miller, this decision is entirely yours. If you would rather go home, I will personally see that you arrive safely. If you would prefer to stay, I would be honored to share a meal with you. No one else will make this choice for you." For a moment I forgot about Ryan, Daniel, the curious diners, and every painful word that had been spoken earlier. All I could think about was the simple fact that someone had finally placed the decision in my hands. It was the first real choice anyone had offered me in years. The room remained perfectly still while I searched for an answer that should have been simple. Every instinct told me to apologize, to decline politely, and to disappear before the evening became even more complicated. That was what I had always done. It was easier to leave than to become the center of unwanted attention. Yet Adrian had not spoken to me with pity. He had spoken to me with respect. There was a difference I had almost forgotten existed. I slowly placed my jacket back on the chair. If the invitation is genuine, I said quietly, then I would like to stay. Adrian inclined his head with the faintest smile. It is entirely genuine. Ryan stared at me as though he had misunderstood the conversation. Ethan, you do not have to make a dramatic statement. I turned toward him for the first time without feeling the need to defend myself. I am not making a statement, I answered. I am making a choice. The word surprised even me. They carried a confidence I did not recognize until they had already left my mouth. Adrian noticed. There was no visible reaction beyond a small nod, but somehow I sensed that he appreciated the answer. Ryan leaned back with a frustrated sigh. You are seriously staying? Yes, I replied. Daniel shifted uneasily beside him. Maybe we should leave, he whispered. Ryan hesitated before standing. He looked at Adrian as though hoping for some explanation that would restore the evening to something familiar. I hope you understand this will create unnecessary rumors. Adrian answered calmly. People are free to tell whatever stories they choose. I prefer to concern myself with facts. And what fact is that? Ryan asked. Adrian folded his hands neatly on the table. That no guest invited to dinner should leave hungry or humiliated. Ryan had no answer. After a brief silence, he picked up his jacket. Daniel offered me an apologetic smile before quietly following him away from the table. Several nearby diners discreetly watched them leave. Their curiosity had shifted entirely. Earlier they had watched an Omega being rejected. Now they were watching the same Omega remain seated while everyone else walked away. The balance of the evening had changed so completely that it almost felt unreal. As soon as Ryan disappeared into the lobby, the atmosphere relaxed. The tension that had quietly surrounded our table seemed to dissolve. Adrian's assistant approached with remarkable timing. Sir, he said respectfully, would you like the dining room prepared? Adrian glanced toward me instead of answering immediately. Mr. Miller, would you prefer privacy or would you rather remain here? I looked around the restaurant. Only minutes earlier every pair of eyes had made me wish I could disappear. Strangely, I no longer felt that urge. Here is fine, I said. I have spent enough of my life trying to hide. Adrian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then here it is. The assistant nodded and quietly spoke with the restaurant manager. Within moments, the empty place settings were replaced with fresh tableware. New menus appeared, and a server politely offered recommendations as though the evening were beginning instead of being rescued from disaster. No one mentioned what had happened before. They simply treated me like any other valued guest. I had never realized how extraordinary ordinary kindness could feel until that moment. Adrian noticed me studying the menu without turning a page. Is something wrong? He asked. I smiled awkwardly. Everything looks expensive. He answered without hesitation. Then order what sounds enjoyable. I do not want to inconvenience you. You are not. His reply came so naturally that I believed him. For several quiet seconds we simply looked over the menu while the pianist continued playing in the background. The restaurant gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but I could still feel occasional curious glances drifting toward our table. They no longer embarrassed me. Instead, they reminded me of something unexpected. Earlier that evening I had arrived believing I would once again be forgotten before anyone truly saw me. Instead, one person had looked past the awkward introductions, the uncomfortable silence, and the assumptions everyone else had accepted without question. For reasons I still could not understand, Adrian Blackwood had chosen to see me exactly as I was, and somehow that simple decision had begun changing the way I saw myself. The meal arrived with quiet efficiency, but for the first few minutes neither of us seemed interested in the food itself. The silence between us did not feel uncomfortable. It felt unfamiliar, like standing in a place where neither of us needed to perform for anyone else. I finally gathered enough courage to look up from my plate. May I ask you something? Adrian set down his fork and nodded. You may ask anything. I hesitated. Why did you stay? His expression remained thoughtful rather than surprised. Because walking away would have been easier, he answered. And I have learned that the easiest decision is not always the right one. I considered his words carefully. Most people would have ignored what happened. Most people already did, he replied calmly. That does not make it acceptable. I looked around the restaurant. The curious attention from earlier had faded. Conversations had returned to normal, glasses clinked softly, and the pianist continued filling the room with gentle music. Somehow the same place that had felt so intimidating an hour ago now seemed almost peaceful. Adrian noticed my expression. You look more comfortable. I smiled faintly. I think I finally remembered how to breathe. A quiet warmth appeared in his eyes. That is a good beginning. We spent the next several minutes talking about ordinary things instead of painful ones. He asked where I had grown up. I told him about the small neighborhood on the east side of the city where everyone knew one another by name. I admitted that I enjoyed visiting used bookstores on weekends because I could spend hours reading without anyone expecting conversation. He surprised me by saying that he collected first editions. Whenever his schedule allowed him enough time to visit independent bookstores instead of auctions. The more we spoke, the more difficult it became to connect the calm, attentive man sitting across from me with the larger-than-life reputation that surrounded his name. Eventually I laughed at one of his dry observations, then immediately covered my mouth in embarrassment. I am sorry. Adrian tilted his head slightly. For laughing. It has been a long evening. Then I am glad something improved it. Before I could answer, his assistant approached quietly and leaned close enough that only Adrian could hear the message. Adrian listened without interrupting. When the assistant stepped back, Adrian looked toward the large front windows overlooking the street. I followed his gaze. 2 black luxury sport utility vehicles had pulled up across the street. Several well-dressed men remained standing nearby, speaking into wireless earpieces while casually observing the entrance of the restaurant. They were not causing a disturbance, but their attention seemed unusually focused. Is something wrong? I asked softly. Adrian returned his attention to me before answering. Not wrong. Unusual. He reached for the glass of sparkling water in front of him and took a slow sip. My assistant just informed me that those vehicles arrived shortly after Ryan left. A quiet chill settled over me. Do you think they are connected? Adrian did not rush his answer. I prefer evidence over assumptions. His assistant spoke again in a calm voice. Our security team recognizes one of the vehicles. It has been seen before during private social events involving Marcus Vale. The name sounded familiar, although I could not immediately place it. Adrian noticed my confusion. Marcus Vale organizes exclusive introductions between wealthy families, he explained carefully. Some of his methods have attracted unwanted attention in recent years. I frowned. I have never met him. Adrian studied my expression for several seconds, as though searching for something. Finally he asked a question that made my heart skip. Mr. Miller, before tonight, did anyone encourage you very strongly to accept this blind date? Images of my stepmother insisting that I could not refuse, reminding me that disappointing the Carter family would embarrass everyone, returned with startling clarity. I slowly nodded. Yes. She said it was too important to cancel. Adrian's expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened ever so slightly. Then before we leave this restaurant, I believe there are still a few questions that deserve answers. Adrian remained silent for several moments, giving me enough time to process everything he had just said. Outside the restaurant, the black sport utility vehicles remained parked beneath the streetlights, their presence noticeable without becoming disruptive. The elegant atmosphere inside Belmorn House continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet I could no longer ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. I do not understand, I admitted quietly. Why would anyone care about a blind date? Adrian folded his napkin neatly beside his plate before answering. Because sometimes a meeting is exactly what it appears to be. Other times, it allows people to observe someone without attracting attention. I frowned. Observe me? He nodded once. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wanted to see whether you would arrive alone, how you would react under pressure, or whether you had anyone willing to stand beside you. His words sounded almost impossible, yet they explained something I had not been able to understand all evening. My stepmother had insisted that I attend despite my repeated hesitation. Ryan had arrived with someone else as though the original arrangement barely mattered. Too many pieces no longer fit together. Adrian's assistant approached once more, holding a tablet. Sir, we confirmed the reservation history. The table was originally booked under Ryan Carter's name for 2 guests. 30 minutes before dinner, another name was quietly added to the reservation notes. Adrian accepted the tablet and studied the screen before handing it to me. I looked down in confusion. A short internal note from the restaurant manager appeared beneath the reservation details. Please accommodate additional observers if requested. No further explanation had been included. Observers? I whispered. Adrian calmly took back the tablet. Restaurants rarely write instructions like that without a reason. I looked toward the front windows again. The vehicles outside had not moved. Instead of frightening me, the realization left me with an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time that evening, I was no longer facing uncertainty by myself. Adrian stood slowly from the table. Mr. Miller, I believe it is time to leave. I rose as well. Should I call a rideshare? Adrian gave a small shake of his head. My driver will take you wherever you wish to go. I cannot ask that of you. You did not. He smiled faintly. I offered. Together we walked toward the front entrance. The restaurant staff wished us a pleasant evening with the same warmth they had shown every respected guest. As the doors opened, the cool night air drifted inside. One of the black vehicles across the street quietly pulled away without approaching us. The second followed a few moments later, disappearing into traffic without incident. Adrian watched until both sets of taillights vanished. Only then did he continue walking toward a waiting sedan parked beneath the entrance canopy. His assistant opened the rear door before stepping aside. I paused beside the car instead of getting inside. There is still something I do not understand, I said. Adrian waited patiently. You came here because Ryan invited you. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. No. The single word stopped every other thought in my mind. Then why were you here? He glanced briefly toward the brightly lit restaurant behind us before returning his attention to me. Earlier this afternoon I received information that an Omega attending tonight's blind date might not be receiving the entire truth about the evening. My heart skipped. You mean me? I did not know your name at the time, Adrian replied. Only that someone deserved the chance to make an informed decision instead of being quietly pushed toward one. I searched his face, trying to understand. So you did not come because of Ryan? No. You came because of the Omega? Yes. The answer settled over the quiet street with remarkable simplicity. Adrian opened the car door himself before looking back at me with the same calm certainty he had shown from the moment we first met. I expected to verify a report and then leave. Instead, I met someone who remained gracious after being treated unfairly, someone who answered every difficult moment with dignity instead of resentment. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Miller, I did not choose to stay because I felt obligated. I stayed because after meeting you, leaving no longer felt like the right decision. For the first time in many years, I stepped forward not because someone else had arranged my future, but because I was finally walking toward one that I had chosen for myself.